Previously, we discussed the idea of the middle ground approach, which attempts to avoid skepticism while acknowledging the role that social networks play in shaping science by holding that science is both social and engages with the world. We discussed the idea that engagement of the world takes place through refining and improving scientific methodology. And we also briefly mentioned the idea that the social aspect of science involves keeping the scientific community diverse and open. But it is still a bit unclear what precisely we mean by diversity and openness. Unfortunately, we cannot really examine the idea of openness in a lot of detail. So here we will focus on diversity. Now, as we will observe pretty quickly, questions about diversity get complicated pretty quickly. What I'm going to do in this lecture is to give you quick snapshots of how we might understand diversity. And we will talk about why we value diversity later on, and especially when you watch the video by Scott Page. So for many of us, when we first think about diversity, I think we think of these images. Diversity, as we currently understand and typically understand it, is the idea that we value individuals regardless of the color of their skin, their gender and sexual orientation, religion or physical ability. This is especially important with respect to workplaces like the workplace and schools, because historically such places have often marginalized and excluded individuals on the basis of these characteristics. Because this kind of diversity relates to demographics, let's call it demographic diversity. Now, when it comes to inquiry, we are not only concerned with demographic diversity. We are also concerned with another kind of diversity that is less commonly discussed: cognitive diversity. So now you might ask, what is the relationship between these two concepts of diversity, demographic diversity and cognitive diversity? Well, watch the YouTube video I have assigned by Scott Page to find out more. But let's look more carefully at what we mean by cognitive diversity. So to illustrate what we mean by cognitive diversity, let's turn back the clock. So the picture you see here, it was a group of friends during our USB days. So since I will be using the group as a way of illustrating what I mean by cognitive diversity, allow me to properly introduce them. So here we are concerned primarily with their disciplinary focus when they were undergraduates. So first, on the left, you have Yifeng, who was a geography major. Next, you have me, a philosophy major. Besides me, on the right, a life science major, Kishan. And next to Kishan, Julie, who was an economics major. And finally, we have Moniza, a literature major. So suppose back in the good old days, we signed up for a USB competition, which was looking for the best answer to the question, how should we deal with economic inequality in Singapore? And this, I think, is a pretty complex question, where complexity here just refers to the fact that this question involves a system that has many components that interact with one another, and to understand the nature of the system completely, we need to understand its constituent parts, meaning the parts that make it up, and also understand how these parts interact. I will say more about how we should understand or think about these kinds of problems later on, but for now, let's go back to diversity. So, naturally, because they are from different disciplinary backgrounds, partly because of that, the group will have different ways of searching for the right answer, meaning that people within the group will have different ways of searching for the right answer. They will employ different methodologies, right? The economists might think about constructing models, comparing different policy interventions. The philosopher would think about the legitimacy of various policy interventions and why that's important. And finally, because they employ different approaches to examining and understanding the question, let's call this kind of diversity approach diversity. Okay, but there is another related kind of diversity, which the example that I've introduced of my friends and I also sort of neatly brings out, right? Now, besides employing different methodologies, right, individuals, especially if they come from varied disciplinary backgrounds, might often have different ways of thinking and talking about the problem, even if they're talking about the same issue, right? In other words, they might have different lenses or heuristics or frameworks in terms of understanding and discussing the problem. So because we are talking about diversity with respect to frameworks or heuristics, right, what we can call heuristics or frameworks or lenses, let's call this kind of diversity framework or heuristic diversity. So this kind of diversity might seem a bit more abstract, so let's look at some examples. So we begin with geography. So geography by its nature tends to focus on, as the name implies, geographical or spatial, meaning space, right, to describe space, relations between people. So naturally, when geographers think about inequality, they will focus on a dimension of inequality that is often sort of less discussed, at least in the Singapore context, the role that neighborhoods play in fostering inequality. Right? So specifically, because geographers tend to think of the grammar of spatiality, so to speak, they will focus on understanding how inequality manifests itself not only between neighborhoods, like for example, the wealth disparity, say, between Bukit Timah and some parts of Bukit Merah, but also within neighborhoods, such as comparing how individuals of different incomes lead very different lives despite living within a stone's throw from one another. So the way that a geographer will think about inequality, in other words, will tend to focus on how inequality tends to manifest itself in geographic relations, and they will argue that to properly address inequality, we need to think through a geographic lens, which will emphasize, amongst other things, what I have mentioned so far. Okay. So then the life science major might think about the issue from the lens of healthcare provision. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, has shown that economic inequality is a problem, partly because it can often lead to lower income individuals being more susceptible to infectious diseases, partly because of the kinds of jobs that they are working in might require more contact, they do not have the opportunity to work from home, and so on and so forth. The life science major might also focus on how improving health outcomes for young children might be especially important for combating inequality, as individuals' life chances and prospects might be correlated with good conditions for early childhood development. And also maybe other fields might have similar thoughts, such as people who study childhood psychology or people who study education, for example. The life science major might also focus on how inequality affects the aging process differently for individuals across socio-economic status. So again, here we see that the life science major emphasizes different aspects of inequality and thinks about their causes and their effects in sort of different ways. Next, the economists will tend to sort of conceive of the problem naturally in economic terms, meaning that they will think about policy interventions in terms of economic solutions, such as ensuring adequate social mobility. Economists also tend to conceive of problems in terms of trade-offs, so they will be able to articulate the possible costs and benefits of adopting various solutions, which is often important in helping us to assess which policies might more likely to be efficacious in practice. Now, someone who specializes in literature might have a completely different way of thinking about and communicating about inequality, right? So instead of focusing on structural or policy issues primarily, they might be thinking about the lived experience of individuals living in an unequal society, They might focus on the narratives that we often invoke to justify inequalities and attempt to question and probe these narratives to show that they perhaps do not capture the complete experience of individuals in Singapore. So a good example of one sort of approach, of this kind of approach, is Professor Teo Yo Yen's "This is what inequality looks like." Now, finally, a philosopher might think about the question of inequality in a different way. They might ask the ethical question: why should we be concerned with inequality in the first place? What makes inequality objectionable? And using those answers, we might also think about the extent to which inequality is objectionable and also examine whether the inequality we currently face is a problem that we should address. The philosopher also thinks about policy interventions in terms of their legitimacy. How can we ensure that whatever policy we propose is something that is acceptable to all citizens? What would such a policy look like? This is important, the philosopher will argue, because if citizens do not see that they have good reason to accept certain policy interventions, they might reject it or seek to overturn it where possible, and thus foil the potential success of the proposed policy reform. Now, at this point, I should stress two things. First, I've only laid out the bare bones of what each discipline brings to understanding inequality. We cannot hope to address such a complex and knotty with a K issue in a few minutes. Second, the different ways of thinking and framing the issue are reliant upon general caricatures of the discipline that do not always hold. The general point I want to make is that typically our different disciplinary training often gives us different ways of conceiving of a problem, and perhaps inequality is a good illustration of how this might be the case. So if you want to learn more about inequality itself and in its relationship to another big issue or concept, democracy, you can find out more in my inquiry class, Democracy and Inequality, where we examine these issues in even greater detail. So, in general, we can see that even from this small group of people, this small group of 5 people, all of us, right, would be able to fit a table basically under into a restaurant on the same table under existing safety distancing measures, right? You already see within this small group of 5 significant cognitive diversity, both in terms of approach diversity and framework diversity. This really shouldn't be surprising, especially when you are in an interdisciplinary environment like the USP, right? You would expect to find some kind of cognitive diversity, given that that's sort of like what we are trying to promote here. So, in that vein, I want you to reflect on the following questions. In your own groups, both within USS and outside, in the USP, in generally, your experiences working or studying outside the university, and your field of study, what are your preferred methodological approaches? How do you tend to approach questions? And here are some other questions to ponder. Are the groups you interact with cognitively diverse? Has such diversity been helpful? How do these groups manage diversity? And now you might have a bigger question. Why bother about thinking about cognitive diversity in the first place? Well, you can watch the Scott Page YouTube video to find out more, and we'll discuss even more in class. See you then!